this big picture view of where we're going in education to something that's more practical. And I'm going to do something complicated. I'm going to weave backwards and forwards between a PowerPoint, which presents some ideas, but I'm going to then take you into some students' work and take you to some classes. So, but firstly, this is, if you like, it's another talk which follows on from the previous one, where I'm really interested in what these new media affordances are and what the pedagogical alternatives are. So, in fact, what we did in the digital space is we built a model which is still the model of all the learning management systems, which is Moodle, Blackboard, Desire to Learn, Coursera. There are 5 major learning management systems, and they're essentially, technically, they are an upload-download model. Pedagogically, an upload-download model is a hub-and-spoke model, which is like a wheel where the teacher's in the middle and content is flowing out to students who are not very connected with each other. So there was a technical infrastructure which is actually, the model is Microsoft SharePoint. It's a 25-year-old technology, and it happened at the beginning of the web, which is the ability to share files. But also what it brought with it were pedagogical affordances, which really shaped and influenced the kind of pedagogy that we have. Now, what we're in now, we're in an era where Facebook and Twitter and these new social media platforms are technologically fundamentally different, and they're essentially about peer-to-peer interaction. You know, the centre has gone. The centre is the software actually, but the centre as a content provider has gone. So there are different technical models and there are different pedagogical models, and I want to try and give you a flavour of that. But I want to start with a counterpoint, and I've got a very simple, I want to do a simple characterisation of the traditional classroom, and I'm going to use this as a way to analyse the way pedagogy works with these new technologies in an old generation and a newer generation. So here we are in the classroom. By the way, this happens to be the village in Greece where Mary was born. And there are the kids doing their work, and you can see the desks are all bolted to the ground. And if I look around the other way, sorry, this room's quite bright, there's the teacher sitting up on a little stage. By the way, this architecture is absolutely the same architecture that we're in today. Right? It's an architecture that we use all the time. And there we have the textbooks. So one of the things about education that we do is we do a thing called exaphoric reference. So in this room, we can talk about 18th century English poetry, we can talk about chemistry, we can talk about Java programming, we can talk about anything else outside this room, and actually everything else ever can be spoken about in this room, but there's a communicative or a media process which goes on where the outside world is brought in. So how's the outside world brought in? Well, there it is, it's the textbook. And what I want you to imagine just for a moment is that we're doing volcanoes. This is chapter 7, and it's about volcanoes. There can't be a volcano in the classroom. But what we can do is we can bring in chapter 7, and the way we do it is we have somebody who's not quite an expert actually, who writes a chapter about volcanoes. It's a summary of the world, which is pre-digested for the student to be the consumer of that knowledge. So there is the student consuming the volcano's information. Now let me tell you another device. There's a little girl here, and see she's got her hand over here on the volcanoes chapter, and over here she's got her pen and she's writing. And I'm going to tell you the theory of learning. It's a very simple theory of learning. See there? There's knowledge at that fingertip. Sort of comes up here like this, and as you write something on the other side, it sticks, and it's called memory. And in fact, one of the articles yesterday, Kirshner-Sweller, that article that was quoted in the second, even today, a lot of conventional understandings of learning are simply define learning as long-term memory, right? Now, interestingly, this digital world where, look, I can pull out my phone and look up stuff on Wikipedia, and I used to remember a huge number of phone numbers, and I cannot even remember my son's phone number now. Right? So what we have now is we have these devices which have taken away the need to memorise things, even the need to memorise things. This was a pedagogy of memorisation. Now, tell me, I'm going to get to this point, in these digital environments, how much do we expect learning still to be about memorisation? What an irony. Okay, so here we are, I'm looking over the classroom, and I'm looking at that little girl. And I don't know what that little girl's doing or thinking. Now, one of the interesting things which I'm going to get to is in these digital environments, we can know more about what people are doing and thinking via a whole lot of techniques called learning analytics. I'm going to show you that happening later on. But anyhow, we don't know what's happening now. But a minute later, we do know what's happening, and something terrible happens. This is not how the classroom was designed. It wasn't designed for there to be peer-to-peer interaction, and this is almost invariably disruptive because it's a hub-and-spoke model. You know, it's actually a bit like Microsoft SharePoint, to be quite frank, and a lot of our learning management systems, the architecture of this space as an information architecture. And of course, at the end, there comes the test. So we do the Volcanoes test to see whether we've remembered what the textbook told us and what the teacher told us. There's a test. Now, one of the most important aspects of this talk that I'm going to get to is actually the test. And what I'm going to argue, and you've got to imagine how I might argue it, is that I want to build a world where there are no tests. We abolish the test. We have so much data about what every learner is doing all the time that the test is both a strange artifact. You know, what a strange thing to understand what you know about volcanoes by an A, B, C, D question, where the answer is B, but C is a deliberate trick which is designed to look right in order that you can make a fine distinction. It's called a distractor item. So it's a strange psychological game which we learn how to play. We learn to play, and you know what? If I ever do these crazy e-learning courses where you have A, B, C, D answers, I mean, I play the game of eliminating the answer which is least likely, trying to find the trick answer, and oh, it must be that one, right? So we have these very strange artifacts to assess knowledge, of which the test is a good example. I'm going to get to that. So anyhow, here's the model, and the word we're going to use down the bottom here, and this doesn't work in European languages, it only works in English, right, is didactic mimetic pedagogy. Now, didactics in European languages is a generic word for pedagogy. Didactics in European languages translates as pedagogy in English. But in English, didactic has a slightly negative connotation. Didactic is somebody who's telling you things like this. Who's being insistent, you know, I know, you don't know, and you should stop and listen because I'm telling you something which you should hear. So didactics has a slightly negative connotation in English, which I'm afraid, I'm just trying to explain what I mean by that there. And mimetic means memory, mimesis, copying. So I become a competent person in the knowledge of volcanoes by virtue of my having copied cognitively what I've been told. So, how does technology change this? And I've sort of said this already. The answer is not necessarily at all. And this is a list of technologies which I won't go through, all of which actually can change things a bit, but also may change nothing. The flipped classroom is just the teacher at the front of the room, and the fact that it's put on video, it's still you're listening while I'm talking. The e-textbook is still chapter 7's on volcanoes, and the fact that it's on a tablet is epistemologically and pedagogically trivial compared to the fact that it's been summarised for me by a textbook writer, and I'm still the consumer of that knowledge. You're the producer, I'm the consumer, I'm trying to memorise it. The architecture of the learning management system. The learning management system is a syllabus. Week 1, read this, do the assignment. Week 2, read this, do the assignment. Week 4, and these architectures, you know, behind it is actually the logic of SharePoint, which is upload, download a file. But in fact, the way in which it's laid out, the file listing is just a syllabus, right? Again, the same kind of architecture. Procedure-based intelligence tutors are ones where you reach, you know, decision points. You're doing in an algebra tutor and whatever, and there's a right or wrong answer at that point, and it's like the item-based test, except it's a bit smarter and games are a bit smarter. Now, all of these things are different. I'm not trying to say that they're not different, but in architectural terms, epistemological terms, pedagogical terms, fundamentally they're often the same. And I can go down clickers, the electronic whiteboard, select response assessments, computer adaptive testing and computer diagnostic testing is unbelievably smart, but the elementary unit you're testing is still A, B, C, D answers with distractors. So the fundamental logic of remembering facts is still there, and so on. And automated essay grading, again, These are all interesting technologies in a whole lot of ways, but they don't change anything pedagogically. So what do we want to do? We want to build a model, and this is the model that I want to show you in practice in a second, which moves away from didactic mimetic pedagogy to pedagogy that we call reflexive and ergative. Now, what do we mean by reflexive? It means there's a lot of cycles of interaction, right? As there is on Facebook and Twitter and whatever. We're used to these media which have a lot of cycles of interaction. Every cycle of interaction is a feedback loop. And by ergative, we mean you are going to be a worker. You know, it's from the Greek word to work. It means you are going to be a worker, and instead of you being a knowledge consumer, you're going to be a knowledge producer. Instead of you reading chapter 7 about volcanoes, we're going to get you to do a volcanoes project, right? You're going to research volcanoes. You're going to use some concepts from physical geography, and you're going to use some concepts from geology, and with those concepts, you're going to take, and by the way, apropos of Mary's point about diversity, you know what I'm going to choose for my volcano? I'm going to choose an Australian volcano, because in Australia the volcanoes were just these lava flows that went along a very flat landscape. And in fact they're tunnels, they're tubes, because what happened was as the outside of the lava flow dried, the inside kept flowing, and there are these tunnels in the Australian landscape which sometimes collapse at various points, which were volcanoes. And I'm going to do that because I'm an Australian. And by the way, someone else might have read that the biggest volcano in the world was just recently discovered very deep under the sea off Japan. And that doesn't look like classical volcanoes. So we'll choose and we will be knowledge producers, because what we have at our hands, we don't need that world outside to be summarised anymore. We can find 1,000 videos, we can look it up on Wikipedia, we have the whole world of knowledge at our fingertips, and we can be producers of knowledge with appropriate pedagogical scaffolds, which is what I'm going to get to. So I've got here a rather dense slide which characterises these as a set of pedagogical differences. So this is what didactic mimetic pedagogy does, and it does it in learning management systems. It does it in flipped classrooms. It does it in MOOCs, right? Everywhere with our technologies we do this kind of stuff. Whereas what we want to do with this new kind of pedagogy are these things on the right. This is a set of contrasts, and I'm very glad you've all got your phones and your pads as a 21st century version of taking notes. It's interesting that writing has become an image, which is Mary's point about multimodality. And in fact, these things on the right are all things which are actually not new. So I'm actually making an old case. Here, these are long-standing aspirations. If you read Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Émile, Tagore, the great Bengali poet and pedagogue who set up a school in Bengal, of course, your own Maria Montessori, John Dewey. You know, people have been saying this, you know, the 18th century for Rousseau, the other folks at the beginning of the 20th century. People have been saying that learning should be engaged and connect to life and be experiential and real. These are really old ideas in education. So what Mary and I are saying is, in fact, not a radical overturning of the order of the world as we know it, but actually we want, at last, after a couple of centuries, we want to make these long-standing ideals real. But the other thing I want to say is the future has been a long time coming. So this is 1954, B.F. Skinner, who created a teaching machine. Now, I mean, you could do a parody, if you like, of the caption down the bottom, about, you know, getting the answers right in learning management systems or in computer adaptive tests at the end of the chapter in an e-textbook. But this is the 1954 version from B.F. Skinner. Pre-digital, by the way, this is like a mechanical typewriter. But a little bit of a story that I quite like. This is just an apocryphal story for the sake of telling stories. The world's first e-learning system was invented at our university, the University of Illinois, in 1959. So we think, oh my goodness, all of a sudden we're doing technology. Sorry, actually 1959 is a long time ago. And this first it was on this big mainframe on the left, and this is actually the 1980 version of it here on the right. And it was a system called Plato. No, that's 59, this is 81. So a system called Plato. But let me tell you something interesting about it, and it's to reinforce Mary's point about us needing to take control of the technologies. This was an educational technology, and let me tell you, ancillary to this educational technology, in other words, trying to apply computing to education, was invented the idea that you can put language in a computer. Before, all those punch cards were just about calculation. So, keyboards. The University of Illinois had the world's first email system. So this was the first time language was put into a computer and language was coded via these numerical algorithmic things to be in a computer. The other thing is, it was the first time a visual screen was created. So researchers at our university created the plasma screen. This is the first plasma screen and the first visual representation to come off a computer. It was also the first time synthesized sound was created, and these were the first games were created by students who were using these computers at the university. So these are 4 or 5 foundational things, and it wasn't created by a big business, it wasn't created for business needs, it wasn't created for profit, it was created for educational needs in a university. So it gives us this is a kind of a moral imperative that we should be doing this again. Now, we are now, of course, 50, 60 years later, there are some very, very big things happening at the moment. And it means that these are interesting times, and it just increases the importance that we do something. One-to-one schools, what that means in the US, it means that everybody has a computer and they take it home, right? And it's happening very rapidly, partly because the devices are getting cheaper, and particularly Chromebooks, which are very, very cheap because everything's cloud-based. That's happening quite rapidly. MOOCs we've spoken about, online schools. Kids in the US, this is at a school level, are not going to school now. In the state of Illinois, there's an online school which has 20,000 students. And these are kids who would otherwise be in jail, otherwise don't like being at school, have a disability of some sort, or they might just not want to be at school. So there's purely online schools are being offered. And of course, the MOOC phenomenon, our college now has more online students than face-to-face students, and that's where the growth is. I mean, for a whole lot of practical reasons. Just-in-time learning, in fact, what we have are these, pervasive informal learning environments, which is help menus and, communities of practice, and likewise, assessment technologies are moving on really, really radically in some very interesting ways, and also big data in education, which I'm going to talk about as I go on, which is just to foreshadow what I mean is that big data is we are capturing thousands and millions of data points while the students are doing their learning of a wide variety of data points, which are actually giving us a pretty comprehensive picture of what's going on. So that little kid that looked up, we didn't know what was going on until she turned around. But now we can know what's going on with learners in all sorts of ways. So this might be a paradigm shift, the first fundamental change since those mass institutionalised education was created. Or is this a moment where we take a step back, where we fossilise these old anachronistic forms? The only important lesson is, in a sense, technology is pedagogically neutral. But it has affordances. Mary and I have been writing about this for a while. These are some of the things that we've written, ranging from highly technical stuff about semantic web and semantic publishing through to stuff about text and ubiquitous learning, and there's some of the things that we've done. But now what I'm going to do is get into something very practical. When I start showing you into classes and I start showing you into examples of what we've been experimenting with in the work that we've done. So this project began in this form in 2009, so we've been working on this for about 6 years now, 7 years. And it was called the Assess As You Go project. So how do you actually, the most important point is, how do you transform assessment? How do you transform the test? Because the test reverse engineers learning, that's the reality of it. And we've created this environment called Scholar, which has these 5 spaces. I'm going to show you into those spaces, and in each case I'm going to talk about how we're trying to shift pedagogy. So community is a space for classroom discourse. We have a space for learning knowledge making as opposed to knowledge consumption. We can coordinate knowledge communities in this publisher space, we have a learning analytics space, and we have a space where we can share learning modules. We use publishing metaphors. You know, so much of what we do in the web is we use metaphors from a previous era because in a sense we want people, the students, to be makers of knowledge, and the coordination of knowledge is a kind of a publishing process. And we literally publish the students' work into portfolios, as you'll see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the way in which these 4 media forms, communicative forms, aspects of what we do in classrooms, these very, very ordinary things, I'm going to talk about the way in which we can change these 4 things. In a way, almost the most important point is the test, because the test dominates so much. So I'll get to that last, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through these different artefacts, these different forms, these different types of communication, these different media, and talk about the way in which they can be transformed. So I'm going to start with one, the classroom discussion. So here we are, we're having a classroom discussion. Okay, and the classroom discussion is this. We're doing the planets, okay, we're going to do a bit of science, and I'm going to say to you, what's the last planet in the solar system? Come on, put up your hand, put up your hand. You know, you do this, and one person is really only able to answer the question, and the one person needs to give an answer which is a proxy for the rest of the class. So you're going to put up your hand and you're going to say, oh, it must be Pluto, and I'm going to say, yes, that's right. So, so what we're doing there is we're saying, we're reproducing a classic discursive form which Courtney Kasdan, who was for many years a professor at Harvard University and a colleague of ours on the Multiliteracies Project, she, her characterisation of classroom discourse is 3 steps: initiate, respond, evaluate. So the way the teacher runs the discussion is they ask a question, initiate, what's the last planet? Respond, one student puts up their hand, Pluto. Evaluate, yes, that's right. And it's a kind of a, that student is a proxy for the, and by the way, I have a little theory about that student. The person who answers is always the wrong person, always the last person who should be answering. So this is a kind of a, I'm going to talk about how this is a very flawed discursive form and how things can be different. Now, if in fact everybody was able to answer all at once, it would be chaos in a regular classroom with oral discourse, right? But if everybody answered all at once, we'd begin an argument because we know that Pluto may not be a planet and there might be other things that are planets, and it's complicated. Like everything else in life, it's complicated, it's arguable, but we don't have the space for anything to be arguable when there can only be one answer. And where the name of the game is to guess what the teacher expects the answer to be, right? It's not that I'm thinking creatively about the nature of knowledge, I'm just guessing what the teacher expects the right answer to be, because that's the only space we have in this kind of, we don't have time for anything else. So what I'm going to do now is take you into Scholar, and I've got these big things, big slides here, was when I'm going to take you online, which I'm going to do now, and I will probably have been logged out by the time, but I can log myself back in. So this is the Scholar, oh, it's just resizing. This is the Scholar screen. By the way, one thing I might say before I go any further is if anybody's interested to use this, Mary and I have just got another generous, very good, very nice National Science Foundation grant to do work on the learning analytics at the back of this. So if anybody would like to use this and collect data with us and co-publish with us, we've got, we're all the time looking for collaborators, and the reason why I say that is the more data we have in this space and the more users we have in this space, the more we collectively learn. So this is part of a large sort of collective project. So what I've done is I've opened a number of tabs so I don't have to go looking for things. And I'm going to go in first. So when I log in now, if I were to log in this point, the first thing I do is I end up in this page called Community. I'm going to walk you through this in order to show you what a classroom discussion is like in this kind of space. And then I'm going to conclude about how this is the same as a regular classroom discussion and totally different. So, firstly, this is my page. Every student has a page like this, every teacher has a page like this, every page is the same. And down the middle, I have an activity stream, which is an infinite scroll, and it probably won't scroll infinitely. Oh yeah, because I've probably been logged out. I'll log back in a second. And what I belong to is communities, and I don't have friends or followers, I have peers, right? So the basic logic of, people want to use Facebook and Twitter as educational spaces. They're just wrong. They're just nuanced wrongly in a whole lot of ways. The people I'm working with in a classroom, it's more serious than my friends. And we don't want to use the word student and teacher because these are reconfigurable relationships. A student could coordinate a knowledge community as well. So anyhow, there's all the stuff happening in my world. I have publications over here, which is work that I've done, and so on. And when I go over now into one particular class, this happens to be a class which is live at the moment, and a class which is, it's a class that I'm actually teaching. And in fact, ironically, this week my class is talking about exactly this topic, the idea of the classroom discussion. And in that space there, I put a little video. So, when I say things that are critical of the flipped classroom, it's not that video's a bad medium. Video's a great medium, so there's a little video in there. But the aim of the video is not for you to listen and give the right answer in a test, but the aim is to discuss the question that I put there. And what happens here is these are my students all responding. Okay, so what we have here is in a way a cross between a social media activity stream and a blog. It's a kind of a hybrid. Neither of those things work totally well for education, but we've tried to build something which is well calibrated that way. And if I want to join the discussion there, I type something in and I add a comment like so. So that's the basic architecture of what's going on here. I might say as well, just before I talk about how this is different, which I will in a moment, one of the things we do in this space is when we go to make an update. So the way in which we communicate with the members of a group or with our peers. So from a personal page, it's communicating with peers. Within a community, it's communicating with members of the community. Is when I go to make an update, and I think that's not going to show me there because I'm logged out. Sorry, I'm going to have to log back in again. Just give me one moment. Yeah, I am logged out. Just give me a moment. Actually, I'll go back to the login screen and log in. It's because I timed out while while I was talking. There we go. Now I'm live. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to make an update, and this is what an update is. This is the opposite of a tweet. So see here. It's a big space. Now you can make it smaller or you can make it bigger. There's a thing that you can pull it up and down here. This is the opposite of a tweet, and in that thing I can put videos, I can include external media. The external media might be SoundCloud, might be YouTube, might be GitHub, it might be a stretch of code in GitHub, for example. Any external media can be embedded in line in that space. So that's, and by the way, when I make an update, I can choose to feed that update also to Facebook and Twitter. So it becomes a tweet, it becomes a line item in your Facebook feed, but when you click that line item as the tweet, or you click the link in the tweet, or you click on the Facebook link, it brings you back to here where a sensible discussion can happen. You can't have a sensible discussion that's mixed up with badly behaved adolescents and births of babies and all the crazy stuff that happens in Facebook. And also the spaces are nuanced wrongly for that. So it's meant to be on a kind of the same play, it's on a level playing field with other social media, but every click brings you back into this space to do the work. So let me go back now to the PowerPoint, and I want to draw some conclusions about this. So, and about this as classroom discussion. So let me go to here. So this is how, as a place for classroom discourse, it's utterly different. Now what's utterly different is everybody responds all at once, right? That's the first thing. One person responds, everybody responds. That's a massive difference. It's the same logic of initiate, respond, right? It's the same logic, But there's a huge difference between one person answering as a proxy for everybody else and everybody responding. There are also lowered barriers to response. So, you know my theory about the person who puts up their hand and responds is always the wrong person. The really important person is the person who's reticent to respond, okay? And the lowered barrier to response is that when you go down to that comment space and you've got actually just a few seconds to think about it before you press the add comment button, that gives you a little bit of time to gather your thoughts, but also while that's happening, you're beginning to see other people's responses come in, and you gain confidence, or you gain confidence that what you're saying, which is slightly different, is still worth saying. But also when everyone responds, learner differences become visible and valuable. This is the subtlety of the diversity point that Mary made. The architecture of expecting one answer, which is the student guessing the right response for the teacher, is an architecture of enforced sameness. When everyone responds, what becomes immediately visible is different voices, different perspectives, different ideas, and people start talking to each other. I didn't show you this, but in that thing with my students, they're going at name, they're all talking to each other because something that one of the others said prompted a thought which was different from theirs, and it set them thinking. It's also highly engaging. In fact, in terms of cognitive load, sitting and listening to one person answering, so you've got 30, 50, 100 people in a room and they're all listening to one answer, that's pretty boring. You know, your brain goes a lot faster than the sound of speech, and sitting there listening to one person answering, your mind easily wanders. But when you get 40 responses or 100 responses all flowing in all at once, that's about the cognitive intensity that we've got used to in the world of new media. The next thing is the read-write mix, and the participation mix is about right. So listen, when there's one person answering, you are in a read mode. You're just listening. You're in the passive mode, right? But here, we're expecting you to be active and passive, read and write, in an equal mix, right? So, you know, again, in terms of traditional media, the old textbook or the old newspaper was, we're going to tell you something, you're going to read it, and you're going to passively consume it. In Facebook and Twitter, there's an equal measure of read-write. Produce, consume, and we want to reproduce that in the classroom. We want to break out of the four walls of the classroom and the cells of the timetable. There is no difference between doing this live, so we could all do it in this room at the moment live, as we do when we tweet in a room, or we can do it overnight as homework, and there is no difference in the discursive form between being physically in the same room at the same time and being in different places at different times. The discursive architecture works the same in both ways. Now, this is Mary's ubiquitous learning point. This fundamentally changes the need even to have these spaces in these kinds of architectural forms. It's okay to have them, and we can, this is workable. In fact, this works well in these spaces, but there's no need for them either. Anyone can be an initiator. So the other thing too is the teacher initiates, the student responds, the teacher evaluates. You could have the student initiating, starting a topic, and in this architecture is making an update. You saw that box come up. A student can make an update as well. And finally, a new transparency, learning analytics and assessment. So look, remember we didn't know what that little girl was thinking? What I can say now is every one of you must respond, and I've got learning analytics that can interpret how much you've done, how much time you spent doing it, how many words you wrote, and we're not far off being able to compare the prompt text, the substance of the prompt text, with the substance of the response using natural language processing technology. We're not far off being able to measure the quality of your response. So we might have 150 responses there, a hell of a lot of data, which as a teacher I could not normally deal with, which would have been absolutely invisible in a traditional classroom, and we can perform sophisticated learning analytics on this. And by the way, this is one of the 6, 12, 20 things that will replace the test. So that's the first of these artefacts, classroom discussion. The second artefact that I'm going to get to, and I'm actually going to put two artefacts together now, or two elements together, two media objects together, if you like, before I get back to show you into Scholar, is the lecture. And this is how the lecture was invented. The lecture is actually a strange artefact, which was probably, in classical Greece, Socratic dialogue was dialogical, right? Confucian learning was dialogical. If you know, the Analects of Confucius are essentially dialogues with people, right? A very strange artifact gets invented, I'm going to say, by St. Benedict in 530, and it comes with Western monasticism. Was this building a monastery once? Yep, okay. So these institutions of higher education that we're in are actually modelled on the institutions invented by St. Benedict in the forms of Western monasticism. And I like this phrase: it belongeth to the master to speak and teach, becometh the disciple to silent and listen, otherwise known as the video lecture, right? It's a strange discursive form which gets invented as a form of pedagogy in early modern, well, late medieval Europe, or medieval Europe actually. The next artefact that we're interested in is the textbook. And again, one of the great inventors of the textbook is this man, Petrus Ramus. Is his name even there? Yeah, Petrus Ramus, there. So the most prolific author, who's now almost entirely forgotten, in the 16th century Europe, was a textbook writer by the name of Petrus Ramus. He was a professor at the University of Paris. And by the way, a nice sort of footnote to the story, he ended up being murdered by his students, but not because he invented this artefact, I don't think. Anyhow, he didn't have an original thought in his mind. He regurgitated geometry. This happens to be an English edition of a Ramus text from the 17th century, but he regurgitated Euclid, he regurgitated, you know, Aristotelian rhetoric and logic and, you know, all these canonical forms of knowledge. Didn't have an original thought in his mind, but he invented a new textual form. And the new textual form looks like this. See, there are little diagrams there. There's point number 9, point number 10, point number 11. So what he did is he simplified things and laid it out piece by piece in this logical structure in a way that the classics were never laid out that way, right? So he invented this pedagogical form which went with these large lecture theatres at the University of Paris, where he was a professor. So all the students could be on the same page at the same time. Students, we're doing point number 10, that's where we're up to. We're all working together and we're working through this regurgitated knowledge. It's this business of exaphoric reference, how do you bring the outside world into the classroom? Here's how that's how we do it. So I'm going to jump over now and show you how we do things differently in the scholar space and how we've tried to think about some pedagogical alternatives. So let me just jump out of that and let me jump back to the web. And I'm going to go here. And now what I brought you into is I brought you into the second space. So when we spoke about classroom discourse, we were in the space called community. Now we're in a space called creator. You're not a knowledge consumer, you're a knowledge creator. And this is just a dummy work that I have where I've thrown in a bit of nonsense. So what I've got is I've got the students. I'm a student now and I'm pretending I'm going to write a project about climate change. So I'm researching stuff on the web, I'm writing about climate change, and ignore the fact that we can put mathematical notation in here. There's nothing in terms of, it's irrelevant to this nonsense topic here, but you know, we can put in video, we can put in audio, we can embed media by uploading it in line. There might be data sets, might be all sorts of things. Or we can embed external media of any variety, any external digital media, all in line. So this is one of these places where we do these multimodal knowledge representations. The other thing we do as well, just to show you what the artefact is we don't want a space that has a lot of pages. We don't want a space where we have a lot of scrolling. We also want to know the information architecture of the students' thinking. So see here, this is a set of different heading levels. Hoping I haven't been logged out. What I could do is, let's say that subheading, I want it there, and I want to, I might have been logged out. And then I want to make that a third order head. So this is a way to think about the architecture of your thinking. And see here, global weather, that looks like an italic, but in fact, that's an emphasis. And see here, this is an indented quote. Here, it's not, yes, I've been away. I've got to, sorry folks, I'm going to have to, I'm logged out there. Anyhow, see this here, I'm going to try to change it now. That's not a quote, that is a quote. This is actually what's called a semantic editor. So technically one of the things that Mary and I have been working on is something called semantic publishing connected to the semantic web. I hope I'm logged back in now. And by actually marking that up as a quote, we know you've said it's not your work, and therefore when we do a language analysis of the language level of your academic writing, we exclude that. And when we look for plagiarism, we exclude that because you have actually told us semantically. Now, one of the enemies of progress, by the way, apropos of, this is just a technical thing around Moodle, is the download business, because the files are inscrutable. You know, if you're using 24-port Garamond and I'm using, you know, 12-point Helvetica, what the hell does that mean? They're actually very hard to read. So we want to build an environment where we can actually read very carefully everything the student's doing at this level of delicacy, a concept they consider important, a quote which is not their writing, which they've declared as that. And I'm going to now just see if I can show you what happens when, what we can always do, these kind of new media objects. If I go view in browser, I hope it's going to come up, that I'm not logged out. There it is here. Oh, well, for some reason the image is broken. All the headings are all the way through there, and that quickly it creates it off a on the fly as a web page. It also creates PDFs on the fly as well. But the idea is, we, in a semantically aware environment with learning analytics, we cannot have documents, we cannot have folders, we cannot have files. As you don't, and for the same reason why you cannot have documents, files or folders in Facebook and Twitter. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you an example. That's kind of the technical part of it, of doing the work. This happens to be a piece of work that I was just looking at yesterday. It happens to be there. It's one of my students' work. And I want to now talk about the social part of this work, okay? So this is a very social environment. So firstly, while this student was writing a piece, so he's writing a piece called Engaging New Students with First Year Interest Groups. He is a technical person at the University of Washington, as it turns out, and he's doing my master's degree. So here, these are the review criteria, which is what's the background and context of this technology, how does the theory work. Actually, it's about educational theory, about how theory is... anyhow, I've got a rubric there that I've created, which is a set of review criteria which he sees while he's doing his work. Now, if I were to review this work now as the teacher, I just pull across a slider. What does a 3 mean? That's what a 3 means. There's the review questions. And by the way, it's thinking I'm logged out, so not to worry. So anyhow, and then I write a comment in there, and then when I'm ready, I go submit. So this is how I give feedback to him along the way. And these happen to be the results, by the way. So here is... there were 3, that's the summary of the results from 3 people. And this, it's logging me out. Sorry, I'm going to go back to here. Actually, look, let me go back here and try to log in again. Sorry about this. This is, you know what, I always vacillate about whether I show stuff live or whether I do screenshots, and I decided with Mary that I'm going to... it's much nicer when it's live, you can see real work, but one of the occupational hazards is getting logged out because you've opened up all these tabs and all that kind of stuff. So just, no, wrong thing, sorry, wrong point. Just hold with me for a moment. Okay, I'll go back to Creator. Okay, and I'm going to go back to, let me go back to here. Okay, so here we've got here the reviews, and by the way, here are the results now, which is, this is a summary of the results, this is the first person's comments, this is the second person's comments, this is the third person's comments here, and by the way, when what the student did is he took on board those comments, he revised, and then what he did is he wrote a self-review reflecting on the changes that he'd made. So we've got this very social process where people are contributing to each other's work and building knowledge, actively building knowledge based on this generalised rubric. And here's the self-reflection where he gave himself, you know, ideally good scores on what he finally did. Here's the work and so on. The second thing Form of feedback in here is annotation, so this is detailed in-textual comments. So see here, University of Washington. You can also talk about other universities, suggestion from somebody here, another suggestion there, even a spelling error, sample figs, does this need to be cited? I'm not so sure. And you can see there he's put in videos interviewing his students at the University of Washington along the way. So what we have is these various forms of feedback. So we have a kind of a dialogical process where on the left we've got the work and on the right we've got social discussion of the work through a number of stages. I'll show you, this is another example from an engineering course. So here we've got Newton's first law going on. They've put all their math equations in here, and look what they've done is this is based on, oh, and by the way, they've got all their data in there. They've put in the drag coefficient quadratic, put in a data set in there as well. And here is them actually, the students at our university demonstrating what they've shown in the engineering work. But the important thing is over here is the rubric on the right, and see it says there, reviewers, the work is not about retrospective judgment, it's about how to give constructive feedback along the way. So I'm going to talk about that in a second, and about how our frames of reference from assessment change from summative to formative. And then these are the results, and you can see here the students have written each other's very, very thoughtful feedback, which goes then towards the final draft, which then gets published in their portfolio of works. So that gives you a bit of an example of how that works. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to, I'm going to show you one aspect of another area before I go on and talk about the test, which is my last point. So here we've now jumped over to Bookstore, where we have these things called learning modules. So see here, these are a whole lot of learning modules which are absolutely not textbooks. And I'm going to show you how they're different from a textbook. So this is actually something that's being taught in a medical class at our university beginning this week, to be quite frank. Hasn't been taught yet. So it's about vaccination and immunisation. And what we have is we have a two-sided architecture here. For the participant and for the instructor, this is just some guidelines for the instructor, and they're going to start talking about vaccination along the way. Here are some vaccination concepts. So rather than do a lecture, there's a PowerPoint there. There is a Centre for Disease Control little online course. There's a PDF from the Centre for Disease Control. And what all the students are going to do is, instead of just reading the textbook and listening to the lecture, they're going to each make an update where they take one aspect of immunisation and become an expert on that and share that with the rest of the class. Active immunisation, passive, attenuated vaccines, killed vaccines, subunit vaccines, antigens, antibodies. Don't read the chapter, write the chapter. Of course, you've got the textbook and you've got all these resources online, you've got the PDF, you've got the PowerPoint, you've got a whole lot of stuff, but we're going to expect you to produce that knowledge and share it with the rest of the group. An activity here about how to talk to parents about vaccines, which is a problematic thing politically and socially, as you all know. And then they have a peer-reviewed case study where they've actually got a case study textbook, but we say, look, here's the textbook of clinical case studies. Create your own case study. It might be a hypothetical case, it might be a real case that you find somewhere in the world, and instead of you reading the case study in the textbook, create an example of a clinical case and then peer review each other's case, and there is the vaccination rubric there. Now, what happens is when I go to post, let's say I'm going to post this here, post left side to content to community, I'm going to find, so this chunk of content on the left, right, which is classroom discussion, I'm going to find a dummy community in order, and I have too many communities in my life, so just excuse me for a second. This is a dummy community, which means it won't go to real students and it won't get confuse them. When I do this, what happens is that chunk of content on the left gets delivered into a social media activity stream, which I hope it did. No, maybe it didn't. Again, this is the problem about doing it live. It should have gone into it. So in other words, what happens is, I'll show you what actually happens is it gets delivered into the content, into the activity stream of the students like this here, and they all start discussing vaccinations. Here's one that's actually a students made where they put videos in it. And see here, at Sarah, people are talking to each other about it. So every student then has to respond either to the update which the admin has made, admin is the euphemism for teacher, or which other students have made. So when they make their thing about attenuated vaccines, every student has to respond to that person's little bit of knowledge that they've contributed with each other. So that gives you a little bit of a flavour of that. Here's another one that we've got, which is one of Mary's and my courses, actually, called E-Learning Ecologies. And see here on the left, we've put in PDFs of articles we've written, and we've put in videos that we've created, and all those things come together, and when it gets posted, people start dialogues about that. So what we've essentially created here is a dialogical form, not a so if what the traditional textbook did was summarise the world to bring into the classroom, we're asking you to be active knowledge makers, to recreate that knowledge for yourselves and to position yourself as that. Okay, last point. I'm nearly there now, and I'm going to move back to the PowerPoint for a second. The test. This is when things get exciting. So, what's this about? This is the logic of the test, right? This is for real, by the way. This is a university in Thailand. It's about individualised knowledge. So what we've done in what I've just shown you is build collaborative knowledge. We're learning from each other and we're giving each other feedback. You know what we're doing is we're teaching you how to cheat. You give the answer to the next person in a rubric and you give other people feedback, and what you know is at the end, the content of your knowledge is part of a social production, right? Whereas here, this is individualised, it's memory, it's closed book, you can't look things up, you can't take anything in, and so on. This is this classic kind of didactic pedagogy. But the other thing about these kinds of pedagogies is this is what they aim to do. They're actually structured systems which insist on inequality. So if I put people over this curve, it doesn't matter how good you are, if you're not as good as somebody else, we must find that a large number of people are not very smart, a large number of people are mediocre, in order for a few to be really smart. Now, in fact, what we've done in this environment is the old idea of mastery learning. By giving feedback along the way, what you find is in a first draft, there's a lot of unevenness between the works, but by the time you've seen other people's drafts of their work, and by the time you've been given feedback, if your work is not as good, by the end they end up very similar. And what we aim to do is in the self-review at the end, if everybody gives themselves top marks, they've actually achieved the standard. So, so in other words, what we've tried to do is not just break apart the assessment system in terms of where the data comes from, but break apart the assessment terms in terms of our objectives, right? Which is mastery learning as opposed to being spread across a normal distribution curve. So what I'm going to do now, I have to jump over that, I'm afraid. I'm going to go out to the Scholar space and show you into analytics, by which point I'm nearly done. So now I'm in the analytics space. These are my analytics, all the stuff I've done in my world. But I'm going to go into one particular community now, and this is actually a community of veterinary medicine students who are all writing cases, clinical cases of animals that are unwell. Okay? And in fact, this is all live data, and I should have their names obscured, but I don't. This is all real people. There are 130 students in the class. They did that many versions of their drafts of works. This was the average version length. This is the percent edited. So to what extent did you change your work based on feedback? This is the academic language level, which is not that useful for higher ed, but certainly useful for schools. And what's interesting, average peer review rating, average self-review rating, where there are more. Green is, by the way, a standard deviation above the norm. Red is one standard deviation below. The average self-review and the average publisher review, which is the admin, the teacher actually did reviews. The average overall review rating. And in fact, each of these is multiple data points because there were 6 or 7 review criteria. And what we've shown is that a lot of the time that there's an overall correlation between peer ratings and expert ratings. This is the number of reviews authors, the number of the review lengths, how much you contribute to other people's work, the number of annotations you've done. And we then have 20-something data points with which to actually build this up. And what's interesting is, firstly, The scores are scattered all over the place. It defies the old idea that you've got a B+, right? But also it's been a process whereby we're tracking changes over time. We're tracking change over time, and we're building up this composite picture. Now, in fact, behind this, across multiple versions and 130 students, and across all this feedback, there's actually 1 million words. We've data mined 1 million words. And if it wasn't in a semantic editor, as opposed to a document someone had uploaded, we wouldn't have been able to data mine it in these kinds of ways. Now, the grant we've just got from NSF is to dramatically extend these data mining capacities as a way to track every single move that every learner makes to get a composite view of what they're doing. That would have been impossible in an earlier era. And what we can do is see this particular work here, Blesdo Nicole. I'm going to go down into her work, and what I can do is I can see the changes she made, the original version, the changed version, review 1, a pile of feedback, review 2, a pile of feedback, review 3, the review criteria. I have a huge amount of data, and I can drill down into that data to see what's happening with an individual student. So this for us is kind of a view of what the future is in this space of learning analytics, which is, and this is what replaces the test. So the points we were making at the beginning about active knowledge making, refiguring those 4 artifacts in these kinds of ways. I'm conscious I'm near the end now. I did have 1 or 2 little videos, but I think I might, and that's basically, let me just go back to the PowerPoint. Oh, I'll just make a few summary points behind that. This was the process that went behind this idea of a project. You know, in a way, this is a version of project-based learning. Oh, the other thing too is, look, this is what's happening theoretically. So that screen that I showed you, there's a very small snapshot of it up the top to remind you. On the left, we've got the work. On the right, we've got a set of dialogues around the work. So it's this kind of split screen, little curtain across the middle. We can pull it backwards and forwards depending on how much we want to see of either side. And what our theory of learning is, this is a kind of a dialectic between the left side of the screen and the right side of the screen, where on the left we have cognition, on the right we have metacognition. So on the left we have learning activity, I'm building knowledge, disciplinary practice, which I'm thinking about a specific topic, which might be volcanoes or a clinical case. I'm doing empirical work, I'm working perhaps individually or perhaps more than one author, and I'm doing learning, whereas on the right I'm doing self-regulation of learning, disciplinary thinking, what are the conditions of thinking about this work, I'm doing theoretical work, it's a space of collaborative intelligence, and it's a space of assessment. So we've got our kind of theory of learning in this space is this backwards and forwards movement, and as you can see here through these multiple phases, it's backwards and forwards. Do the work, look at the rubric, look at someone else's work, give them feedback, look at the feedback you got, go back and revise your own work, write a self-review. So it's backwards and forwards multiple times between these 2 sides of the screen. And this is what we want to achieve, criterion referenced learning. We want you all to become equally knowledgeable, in the topic that you're working on by the time you finish the project, and also self-referenced. What's my progress, as opposed to norm-referenced. And what we want to do with assessment is make a shift away from summative assessment, which is retrospective and judgmental. You know what B+ means? B+ means you're a mediocre person. It's just a moral judgment. It doesn't help you learn anything other than to say, become a better person. Well, that's not very helpful educationally. Whereas formative assessment is prospective and constructive. We're going to use the same measures of knowledge. We want you to learn about volcanoes and we want you to learn about vaccination. The same measures of knowledge are there, but the feedback we're going to give you is going to be prospective and constructive. And retrospectively, we're going to data mine this. That's what our assessment's going to be, a retrospective data mining of assessment, which was in the first instance formative. This is our model of what's going in Scholar. There's all this stuff going on, this activity in communities, and at the centre of it we've got this analytics area which is mining all that work. This is too much now, but this is our definition of big data, and the reason why the big data stuff is just so interesting, and there's just such phenomenal potentials in education. Firstly, every little move is instantly recorded. Secondly, there are many different data types. We can ask questions that have right and wrong answers. We can look at classroom discussion. We can do peer review. We can put quantitative scores on peer review. We can look at qualitative comments. We can do natural language processing. There are many different types of data. It's accessible, it's durable. I've got the million words that were in that vet med course because they weren't handed in as PDFs. And we can do data analytics and visualizations that are based on that. I will show one quick video and then I'm going to call it a day. This is an example of the way we were able to trace thinking. This is another example of, this is with children.
Hi, I'm Shelby, and today I'm working on my science assignment about the American alligator. I've already written my first draft using the rubric to guide me, but before I submit for peer review, I need to finish mapping out my report in InfoWriter. I've done some work already. You can see that I have a definition and a preview, and I cover 5 main concepts: the American alligator, its appearance, its behavior, habitat loss, and climate change. I've linked each concept and provided some definitions with examples and evidence. I use the arrows to trace a thread from the concepts in the introduction to the evidence in the body and then to the conclusion. This helps me to organize my thinking and write in a logical order. In the last concept, I have a good example, but I think I could develop it with more evidence. Maybe I can find a quote or some statistics that show how much of the alligator's habitat has been taken over. I'll write myself a comment to include this when I revise my work.
InfoWriter has an event timeline. This records the path students take as they create their concept maps. See how the bar at the top shows the order that Shelby followed as she mapped out her writing? It shows her thinking as she uses InfoWriter, and how well she understands the structure of an information report.
So that's a little example of how we can trace every little step in thinking. So what the student's doing is diagramming as they're writing their essay. What's the logic of their essay? The essay is supposed to involve, concepts and definitions and claims that are supported by evidence, and we can trace every little bit of their thinking. Last slide then is just by way of summary. This is what we want to move from and to. These are the concepts that Mary introduced before. So this is kind of a quick summary of what we've been trying to achieve with this work. And if you want to go and just set up a Scholar account, you're very, very welcome. And we also, this is CG Scholar. We have a community in there called New Learning, which you're very welcome to join, which also feeds to Facebook and Twitter. So you can join us at New Learning in Facebook or Twitter, but go and join it in the source if you'd like. So that's some of the stuff that we've been thinking about.
Okay.